When it comes to progressivity and redistribution, we as a society and as citizens have quite complex considerations, attitudes, and views, sometimes quite stark misperceptions. The first big element is this idea of the belief in the American dream, a very salient topic in the policy debate, and that really shapes our views on redistribution. The more social mobility you think there is, the more equal opportunity you believe there are, then the less you perceive a need for redistribution, and the more you can, tolerate unequal outcomes. The big issue is that it's not more social mobility per se, but rather more perceived social mobility. So the reality is not always in line with the perceptions of mobility. On the x-axis, on the left graph, you have pessimism, which is the perceived probability of a kid staying stuck in the bottom quintile. So the more you move to the right, the more pessimistic the respondent is. On the y-axis, you have their desired preferred top tax rate. Okay, and you can see that people who are more pessimistic about mobility would like to have a higher top tax rate. On the right graph, it's the perceived, if you want, American dream. It's the probability of moving from the bottom to the very top. And here you can see that people who are more optimistic about this chance want a lower top tax rate. You can see the exact mirror image if you look at, instead of the top tax rate, at the bottom 50% tax rate. It's exactly the mirror image. But here is the perception versus reality. So on this graph, it's about this probability of staying stuck in the bottom, okay, of staying in a poor environment if you're born in a poor environment. In the US, people are relatively accurate on average. In Europe, people are too pessimistic in the sense that they believe many more people will remain stuck in poverty than is actually the case. What about the American dream idea, moving from rags to riches? So that's here. So now again, on the x-axis, you have the actual probability of a kid moving from the bottom to the top. And on the y-axis, you have the average perception. So here the image is very different. European countries are almost accurate, pretty accurate on average. And notice that they have a higher mobility on average than the US. The US is really overly optimistic. So this is true, by the way, if you look at people at different income levels, different education levels. It very strongly varies by political affiliation. So people towards the right of the political spectrum are much more optimistic about mobility than people to the left. But the US really has a salient idea about the American dream, which is currently not true, perhaps was true in the past, but not today. Variation in geography is very stark too. So if you look at this map about actual social mobility by state, darker colors mean more mobility, more kids, that's the number of kids out of 100 that will make it from the bottom to the top quintile. You can compare this to the map of perceptions from our surveys. This is the map of perceptions. So let me put them next to each other for clarity. And you can immediately see that perceptions are unambiguously more optimistic everywhere, but especially in the lowest mobility regions. So in fact, if you take the ratio of the perception to reality, you can see that in the southeast, perceptions are almost double the reality in terms of the chances of moving. Generosity doesn't travel very well across national, ethnic, and religious lines, and people are much more averse to redistributing to people who are more different from them. So simply making people think about immigrants in an experimental way by inverting the order in which you ask them questions about immigrants versus questions about redistribution and progressivity makes people more averse to redistribution. And even to the point where they want to donate less private money to charity. But perceptions about immigrants are actually quite wrong. So to start with, for instance, if you ask people about the perceived share of immigrants in a country, let's focus on the left graph. Each row is one country. The blue is the reality. So for instance, in the US, there's 10% legal immigrants. If you add illegals, it would be around 13.5%. The red is the average perception. So people really starkly overestimate the share of immigrants. If you're worried about outliers, because we do worry that the distribution is skewed, the median is almost the mean. Left and right-wing respondents are very similar in their overestimation of immigrant share. However, they have a very different perceived composition of those immigrants. So let's look at that. So one stark feature as well is the perceived share of Muslim immigrants among 100 immigrants. And here again, the blue on the left shows you the reality per country, and the red is the perceived average share of Muslim immigrants. And you can see that in all countries, people really overestimate the share of Muslim immigrants. And here, if you focus on the right graph, very bottom, you can see that right-wing respondents much more overestimate the share of Muslim immigrants than do left-wing respondents. You can see that people really starkly overestimate the share of the poor that are immigrants relative to reality. And finally, if you want to test directly whether people are more biased against immigrants, you can ask, consider John and Mohammed. They both, make the same income, live in the same state, have the same family situation. Does Mohammed pay more taxes, less taxes, equal taxes than John? And same for transfers. Does he get more transfers, same transfers, less transfers than John? And this is the share of respondents per country that say, definitely Mohammed pays less taxes than John and gets more transfers. Okay, so this is clearly not true given the information we give. Here you can also see a very stark gap between left-wing and right-wing respondents in that answer. What about if we provide news about inequality and how things actually look like in the US, does that change people's demand for redistribution? The answer is no, but it does reduce trust in government and actually makes people really skeptical about the government's benevolence or ability to do things. So what we did in this survey was to tell people, enter your annual household income in the box, and then a slider basically shows you where you are in the income distribution based on that. Then you can actually move around the slider and explore the whole income distribution, see how many households make less than a given amount. We can also look at this dynamically over time. Based on the income you entered, we can tell people if growth had been equally spread since the 80s, where would you be today? And in fact, if you do this, most people except the top realize that they would have been better off. And so for most people, it's negative news here. And what we see is that this does not change demand for redistribution, or barely. However, it makes people think that the government cannot be trusted, that the government is not doing things right. And I'll end on a completely new study which I've been running, which is about the misunderstandings and views on tax policy. So everyone thinks that the top tax bracket kicks in at much lower income levels. So most people think the top income bracket starts at around 200,000, which is far off from reality. If you ask people, were the tax rates in the 50s higher, lower, how high were they? Most people have really no idea that the tax rates were much, much higher, top tax rates in the 50s. When you ask about who's at the top, who are the rich people, who are the high income earners, there's a stark overestimation of people who are, entrepreneurs. That's quite stark. Of people who are scientists, I wish, entertainers, very stark, media, sports, and really an underestimation of people who are managers and executives. Another thing you can do is to very quickly ask people, instead of priming them about one question or the other, just say, what should be the goal of a good income tax system? Write. And so people write in open-ended text boxes. And then you can do text analysis on these responses. And you can do more. You can take these words and actually classify them through an algorithm called topic analysis. And you can look at these topics as they appear by political group, for instance. And you can very clearly see debt considerations, government budget considerations are much more rising to the right, wealth concentrations are much more rising to the left, loopholes are also slightly more prevalent on the left, efficiency is slightly more prevalent to the right. And I'll just end with the estate tax, which is the closest we have to the wealth tax. So it's very unpopular and it's very misunderstood. So most people think that many more households pay the estate tax or will pay the estate tax than is actually the case. The reality is less than 1 in 1,000 households, but people think it's 364 on average out of 1,000. So the exemption threshold, clearly the reforms have not caught up in the popular mind, because it's believed to be 4.6 million, which is much lower than it is now. And just informing people about who actually pays the estate tax, namely how high the threshold is and how few estates are above that threshold, already increases support for it quite dramatically. Let's just ask, what are the main shortcomings that people think about when they think about the wealth tax? It's very clear what the main shortcomings is. That's double taxation. It's again pretty skewed politically. So wealth concentration is the main consideration that comes up for people on the left, and double taxation is the main consideration that comes together with government debt and budget when you talk about to people on the right. So I think there's a lot to be learned from such surveys. There's plenty more information in the paper that I cannot show here, but I think it's critical to really get into our minds as citizens, into people's minds, and try to see what those reasoning, perceptions, and attitudes are. Thank you.